Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Geyn, and today we're talking about sanctions on Russia by Canada, as well as sanctions Russia has imposed in retaliation, and what these sanctions mean for Canadian citizens and businesses. On February 24th, Russia began a military invasion of Ukraine, launching attacks on multiple cities. The war has been devastating, with mounting evidence that the Russian military has committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. Canada has imposed sanctions in response that, for example, impose an asset freeze and prohibits dealings with individuals and entities, imposes restrictions on certain sectors like financial and energy sectors in Russia. It also lists certain individuals as inadmissible to Canada and prohibits the export, sale, or supply of certain goods to Russia. Russia has retaliated by imposing their own sanctions on Canadian individuals, including politicians, journalists, and soldiers. Here today to discuss this issue are three experts. Sean Stevenson is a lawyer with Dentons. Marcus Kolga is a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And Matthew Light is a professor at the University of Toronto. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Marcus, I'd like to start with you. There are a lot of sanctions that Canada has imposed. Can you walk me through who some of the individuals are that have been sanctioned by the Canadian government and what the sanctions mean for them?
Well, sure. Thanks for having me on, Christine. And I'm actually one of those Canadians who's been placed on Vladimir Putin's sanctions list about 3 weeks ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. As far as Canadian sanctions on Russians, there are about 1,400 individuals right now that have been placed onto Canada's sanctions list. Most of those have been placed on the sanctions list over the past 2 months. And they run the gamut from minor officials in eastern Ukraine, in Russian-occupied Ukraine, all the way up to Vladimir Putin's own daughters and Vladimir Putin himself. At the top of those lists, and the oligarchs that are important to Canada, Roman Abramovich is at the top of that list. It's reported that he personally nominated Vladimir Putin to be the successor to Boris Yeltsin in the late 1990s. He, of course, was the former owner of Chelsea Football Club and is known as Russia's leading metals magnet, steel magnet. In the mid-2000s, he bought 5 steel processing plants right here in Canada for an estimated cost of around $2.3 billion. And that value has grown over the years. And so having Abramovich on that sanctions list is very important. And he's also being named by Alexei Navalny, the well-known Russian anti-corruption crusader, as the most important Russian oligarch that can be sanctioned by the West. And there are a number of other leading Putin oligarchs who are on that list as well. So Canada has really followed its allies in placing these names on that list, and there's still a lot more that Canada could be doing as far as sanctions are concerned.
Now, Sean, there are some industries that have been sanctioned as well. So, what can you tell me about industry-wide sanctions? What industries they apply to, and what they mean?
Sure, and thanks for having me on, Christine. A pleasure to be here. As you mentioned at the top of the introduction, Canada's sanctions have been focused on finance, energy, and defense. I would note that sanctions relating to finance and energy were pre-existing the current the current events that started at the end of February, but those have been significantly scaled up. So in terms of finance, what we've seen is a significant amount of designations of Russian banks. We've also seen the designation of the Russian Central Bank, as well as the Ministry of Finance, so that puts a significant curve on doing finance or banking transactions in Russia. In terms of energy, we've seen, of course, the ban of imports on petroleum products and some other listed products in the Canadian sanctions regulations. And then in terms of defense, we've again seen a significant listing of a number of Russian defense players on Canada's sanctions list. So what this means is a broad ban in dealing with those individuals and those entities. So if you are a Canadian or any person in Canada, you are essentially prohibited from dealing with those folks.
So, Professor Light, I'm gonna ask the question now. I'm gonna give you time to answer it in the next segment because we're running up against the clock. But I want to know how the sanctions really fit in to Canada's broader goal of helping Ukraine, helping the people of Ukraine. Canada's doing a lot in terms of aid, in terms of allowing Ukrainians to come here. But I want to know how the sanctions fit into that broader goal. We've got to go to commercial, but I want your thoughts on that when we come back.
Very good.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Canada's sanctions against Russia. Now, Professor Light, I wanted your take on how sanctions against Russia fit into Canada's broader strategy of helping Ukraine in this war.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be with you. So I think that Canada, like its other NATO, faces certain kinds of constraints and dilemmas in dealing with Russia. On the one hand, we are not actually parties to this war. Clearly, we've said on a number of occasions in a very emphatic way that our sympathies are entirely with Ukraine and that Russia is engaging in a war of conquest and aggression. And this is, broadly speaking, the position of all members of NATO. At the same time, we are not fighting in that war, and Canada, like other countries, has taken the view that overt military intervention would essentially be to draw us into a larger war with Russia. And I think the sanctions can be seen in the light of this sort of dilemma that we are trying to help Ukraine in ways that do not make us co-belligerents, so parties to this conflict. And they are related they serve a number of goals. So one is to try to degrade Russia's ability to actually wage war. So a lot of attention has been focused to the sort of strictly economic aspects or financial aspects of the sanctions, and rightly so, as well as to the sanctions on Russian individuals. But part of the goal is to prevent Russia from being able to resupply its military with the parts it needs to continue its invasion of Ukraine. I think the sanctions have certain other goals too that are maybe longer term or more subtle. One is to sort of signal to the people of Russia, among others, that their government is eliciting strong disapproval and condemnation. So the sanctions have a denunciatory value that is separate in addition to their strictly economic value. And I think the third part, which is in some ways the most complex, is that there clearly is a kind of reassessment of relations with Russia that's been taking place, not only in Canada, but particularly in some European countries as well, since the war began its current phase of full-scale invasion, in which it's become harder and frankly impossible to sort of see Russia as a constructive partner. And that has entailed trying to think about how we can deal with Russia going forward in a way that does not risk World War III, but that also doesn't sort of draw us into any kind of overly close relationship with it or allow it to become overly involved in our political and economic systems. And, it's interesting that Western leaders are now saying openly that they intend for the Russian military to be weakened and that they intend to continue their policies of trying to isolate and stigmatize Russia for the foreseeable future. These are not always only economic. So one other arena where I have followed this a little bit is in the case of the International Policing Cooperation Association, Interpol, where there has been so far an unsuccessful attempt to remove Russia from that organization. And I think we're going to continue to see these sort of moves to kind of both symbolic and substantive to kind of limit Russia's involvement with Western governments.
Sean, there's a long list of areas that are sanctioned, but one of the ones that's attracted a lot of public attention is the sanctions on Russian aircraft and vessels. What can you tell me about those sanctions and what has happened to those vessels and aircraft that were already in Canada when those sanctions came into effect?
Well, essentially, Canada has tried to close our skies and our waters to Russian vessels or vessels that are operating for the benefit of Russian individuals. The sanctions are broadly worded, so a careful consideration of the language needs to, of course, be done in every specific case. But it essentially is, if you're a Russian vessel or owned or operated for a Russian person, there is a prohibition that could apply. The prohibitions are slightly different in nature. The prohibition in relation to aircraft is civil in nature, where the vessels are criminal in nature. But we have seen enforcement on the issue, specifically in the aircraft arena, to the extent that an aircraft is viewed as breaching the sanctions. They are immediately told to move to the closest Canadian airport. We have seen fines levied against both pilots and aircraft operators. In terms of ships, what we have seen is global affairs taking an aggressive approach and proactively sending out notifications of potential violations. Essentially, any ship that docks in a Canadian port could be in breach of Canadian sanctions.
We've got to go to commercial break, but in the next segment, I want to talk to all of you about these Russian companies that operate in Canada, some of which are quite large companies. I think Marcus alluded to one of them in his earlier answer, and they're economically significant, right? Some of these are, for example, steel companies that are involved in pipeline construction. And what are they going to mean for the Canadian employees who work at these Russian companies? Are there going to be implications for our economy because we have imposed these sanctions? We've got to go to break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Canadian sanctions against Russia. Now, Marcus, there are Russian companies that operate in Canada. Some are large and economically significant. For example, companies that produce material used by the Trans Mountain Project, and they have ties to oligarchs. So what are the consequences for companies like that and for the employees who work there?
Yeah, you're right. Christine, Evraz Steel is one of the largest Russian companies operating in Canada today. They own 5 steel processing plants in Regina and in various different cities in Alberta. And what those plants do is they process various types of steel and make the material that's used in oil pipelines. It's hard to tell what the long-term impact of these sanctions will be on the employees that work at Evraz. It's unlikely that there will be any sort of negative impact. I don't think anyone is interested in shutting down these plants or watering down the value of those assets. And I think in the very worst case scenario, what might happen is if Canada does actually pass this piece of legislation that's making its way through the Senate right now, the Repurposing of Frozen Assets Act, those Russian assets that are locked up in Evraz Steel, they may be sold off to another entity, a Canadian entity, some other multinational entity. But it's pretty clear that those factories themselves, those steel processing plants, will remain in place, and the workers that work there will not be losing their jobs. And the same goes for any of these other Russian-owned companies that are operating in Canada right now. I think the jobs will remain in place in the long term.
Sean, I want to get your take on the impacts of these sanctions on Canadian businesses. What do you think the major impact will be?
Businesses that have a minority Russian shareholder are in somewhat of a precarious situation. And you need to look at it from both the Canadian perspective and a global perspective. From a Canadian perspective, our sanctions, quite frankly, are drafted in broad terms, and we haven't had any interpretive guidance from global affairs. Despite requests for that. This has left them in a situation where there is uncertainty as to whether or not sanctions may or may not apply. Compared to other jurisdictions, for example, like the United States, which has very clear rules, for example, a 50% rule, where if a shareholder owns more than 50% of a company, that company will be designated or deemed to be a sanctioned entity itself. Canada does not have that type of guidance, so we're in sort of an unclear situation. Although I would agree with Marcus that to date we've seen statements from the Prime Minister at a press conference, similarly from Premier Scott Moe, that these sanctions are not applicable to them. And we have, of course, not seen any enforcement today. So somewhat of a precarious situation, but from a Canadian perspective, what we see to date is a non-application.
Professor Lade, I want to touch on something that Sean just said, which is about how Canada's sanctions on Russia compare to those imposed by our allies like the European Union or the United States. Are we stricter? Are we less strict? How would you sort of compare us to those other jurisdictions?
My impression is that we are roughly consistent with the policies of our major NATO allies. That being said, there are some sort of complexities to these economic measures against Russia that differ from country to country. So one interesting development in the United States is a move in Congress to actually seize the frozen assets of Russian oligarchs, which I think is consistent with sort of the generally more aggressive position of the U.S. with respect to economic measures against Russia over the years, and its strong use of sanctions in general. The other point that maybe should be brought out is that what we refer to as sanctions are only really one aspect of the kinds of economic issues that we're now grappling with as an alliance. So, for example, both Germany and the United Kingdom have come under pressure to reassess certain aspects of their economic relations with Russia, which are really not applicable in the same way to Canada, or at least not to anything near the same degree. So in the German case, that, of course, is their extreme dependence on gas from the Russian Federation, which is brought to Germany by pipelines. They were already essentially compelled under extreme pressure to relinquish one project that was near completion, the Nord Stream 2 project, but they remain under pressure from Ukraine as well as other NATO governments. And I would be interested to know about what Canada is saying in private about this to reduce more quickly or essentially to embargo Russian gas sales. There is a somewhat different but related set of issues in the United Kingdom, in that London is, of course, Europe's and one of the world's leading financial centers, and it's become a hotbed of Russian dirty money.
It's certainly sort of famous for that, I think. We've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing Canada's sanctions on Russia. Now, Marcus, there's now talk of Canada not just freezing assets, but also actually seizing them and selling them. So how does seizing the asset work, and what kind of things would be seized? And is there an estimate of the value of what is being seized in total?
Well, thanks, Christine. Right now, Canadian sanctioning legislation, both the Special Economic Measures Act and the Sergei Magnitsky law, allow the Canadian government to both freeze and seize foreign assets that are targeted by these sanctions. That means that those who are targeted by the sanctions aren't allowed to move those assets in any sort of meaningful way. And sorry about that. It
happens to all of us.
That those assets are seized, but they can't be moved. And so one of the suggestions that's come out now, it's certainly in the Senate, there's a private member's bill moving through it called the Frozen Assets Repurposing Act, which would allow the Canadian government to then sell those assets and use the proceeds from those assets to support victims of human rights abuses. For instance, in the case of Ukraine, supporting the refugees that this war has produced, and using those assets to help rebuild the civilian infrastructure, the destruction of civilian infrastructure that's happened in that country. And our foreign minister, Melanie Joly, just announced her support for that and Canada's intent to pass that legislation. So we should be keeping an eye on that legislation passing very soon.
I'm fascinated by this proposal to sell the assets. Matthew, can you give us any insight into what's selling, how the assets would even be sold? Like, is it going to be like oligarchyachtliquidation.com? Or where do how do they sell these assets? Like, who do they go to sell them?
I am not fully up on the details of the legislation that is making its way through Congress. Maybe what I would point out is that the focus on oligarchs is perhaps a separate dimension of the economic relationship with Russia that is now being reviewed. I was mentioning in the previous segment the role of London as the kind of so-called laundromat for Russian dirty money. But it's not just sort of the actual investment of Russian money into Western enterprises or financial institutions. It's also the international mobility of Russian oligarchs and their ability to inject themselves as personally into Western societies. And I think, one goal of the attempts to seize the property of oligarchs is to make them unwelcome, right? So, for example, Roman Abramovich, who Marcus referred to in a previous segment, has been living in European countries for years. Most recently, he obtained, under very suspicious circumstances, citizenship in Portugal. And that is in the process of being investigated, I understand, if it has not already been revoked. And I think what all these measures kind of add up to is an attempt to sort of essentially make our societies less permeable to these essentially henchmen of this authoritarian regime, the Putin regime, who have grown rich, and it's only fair to add, who have essentially robbed from the Russian people in order to become rich.
Sean, I just briefly want to ask about Belarus. I know that there are existing sanctions against Belarus. There have been for some time, but they are playing a role in this current war as sort of a staging ground for Putin. So, are there any new sanctions against Belarus, and do you think there will be?
Yes, there are, in short. Like you mentioned, there were pre-existing sanctions on Belarus, but those have been ratcheted up as the conflict has escalated, and Belarus has played a more important role. What we've seen again is a number of Belarusian politicians and Belarusian entities be sanctioned by Canada. So again, subject to a broad dealings ban. Right now, there are 25 entities and 50 individuals. So that has been an increase in Belarus. And we've also seen similar sanctions be imposed on them. So similar petroleum bans, similar restricted goods and technologies, and aviation insurance.
I want to thank my guests so much today for coming on. We've heard about the increasing sanctions Canada has put on Russia and Russia's economy, about sanctions on individuals, vessels, businesses, and whole industries. Will these sanctions be enough to slow Russia's brutal and criminal war against Ukraine? Will they be enough to stop it? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.